So good evening, everyone. It is my true pleasure to introduce Professor Stephan Lewandowsky from the University of Bristol and the University of Western Australia. Stephan did his BA at Washington College, Maryland, and his MA and PhD at the University of Toronto under the supervision of Dementors. He served as an associate professor of psychology at the University of Oklahoma before joining the University of Western Australia, and then joined the University of Bristol in 2013. He is a prominent figure in human memory research, and especially computational modeling of memory, and one of the few people who really pushed forward the field of computational modeling of cognitive processes, partially through his introductory books to the topic and a series of summer schools he organized on computational modeling. More recently, his interest in how people update their memory led him to examine the persistence of misinformation, the spread of fake news, the ways in which people accept or reject scientific evidence, and the ways in which we, as individuals and as a society, can resist the harmful effects of fake news and science rejection. A lot of this extremely interesting and important work deals with people's acceptance versus rejection of climate change and of vaccination, topics that really are burning global issues to all of us within and outside academia. He served on many advisory boards and expert panels advising governments and policymakers on the topics of global warming, fake news, and online targeting in social media. He received numerous awards for his research and is very active in parallel to his outstanding scientific work in contributing to public debate through global media. So, Steve, we're lucky to have you here. Thank you for coming, and the stage is all yours.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Yoav. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here and to say hello to so many familiar faces. All right, let me start out by popping a few links into the chat so that I don't have to do it later on. They refer to public-facing documents, including my billboard that I'm sitting in front of, that I've produced during the last year or so to reach out to the public on various different issues, and I'll explain those along the way. Now, the title of my talk, just for those of you who are sort of not current with Harry Potter, it was taken from Harry Potter, and the Dementors are these mythical creatures that suck intelligence and everything else out of people. And I think we live in a situation now in many countries around the world where the Dementors are amongst us. And to set the context, I just want to walk you through a very brief history of lies using American presidents, because, well, we know a lot about them, they're powerful, and some of them sometimes have difficulty with the truth. And there is a sort of a decadal trend here that I want to talk about, which culminated in the career of this individual who, during his presidency, uttered more than 30,000 false or misleading claims, according to fact checkers. That's equivalent to about 21 per day, statistically, on average, although most of those were focused towards the end of his presidency. Now, if you think that's a problem, then I'll have more to say about that in a moment. But to explain the problem, I have to place this into a conceptual framework. And the conceptual framework that I have chosen to work with is one that recognizes a transition from systemic lies to shock and chaos epistemic insouciance. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is that if you look at the history of presidential misleading statements or false statements, they used to have a purpose. Richard Nixon had a good reason to deny Watergate and everything else. Bill Clinton had good reason to lie about his sex life. George Bush, well, he at least he pretended to be interested in the reality in a country called Iraq when he talked about weapons of mass destruction. But Donald Trump doesn't seem to care about reality or even about what it is we believe. And two sociologist colleagues of mine coined the term shock and chaos for that, where lies often have no apparent purpose. Lies uttered by politicians are just exotic and colorful and performative, but who knows what they're supposed to accomplish. And when they're being challenged, then instead of people defending their view of the world the way George Bush and Dick Cheney defended their, claim of weapons of mass destruction, what happens these days, by some politicians at least, is that they engage in something known as ontological gerrymandering. That is, they're even denying the knowability of truth. They're kind of saying, well, why do you bother holding me accountable? Anybody can believe anything they want anyway. And that, I think, is a very important qualitative shift in the type of misinformation in politics that we've observed over the past decade or so, probably actually less than that. And here is one of the fallouts from that. These are presidential approval ratings for Donald Trump, which, as you can see, throughout his presidency were remarkably flat. I mean, jiggles and bumps, but quite flat. Indeed, until after he lost the election, even the pandemic didn't put that much of a dent into his popularity. And at no point in his presidency did he lose support among his party. About 3/4 of Republicans continued to approve of his performance throughout. In fact, they thought he was honest. There are multiple surveys suggesting that Republicans consider Donald Trump to be honest. And so the question is, what's going on here? How is this possible? How can somebody be considered to be honest when he's lying all the time? Now, what I find concerning about this whole development is that if you look at the 20th century, and in particular, the analyses by someone like Hannah Arendt of Nazism and totalitarianism, you find her claim that if people constantly lie, it isn't that the public will then believe stuff that's false. Yes, I mean, that might have happened with the weapons of mass destruction, but that was a carefully curated, competing version of reality. What we're observing now, and what Arendt was suggesting the Nazis did, and the Soviets to some extent, is that they lied so much that people just give up their bearing of the real world because it becomes impossible to differentiate between lies and the truth. And so I would argue that a society based on shock and chaos disinformation will ultimately facilitate authoritarianism. Now, that's a big claim, and I can't sort of, flesh that out empirically all today, but I can talk about a number of instances in which I think one should be concerned about that possibility, at least. And I'm certainly very concerned about that. So this is what I want to talk about. 3 different ways in which knowledge dementors are trying to get us into this Arendtian space where we have lost our bearings of truth and falsehood. One way in which people do that, politicians among others, is through conspiracy theories. And here is a great example, one of many. Donald Trump tweeted multiple times about climate change, and usually dismissing it as a hoax. For example, it was something created by the Chinese to make the US non-competitive. I'm not exactly sure how that would work, but never mind, that is out there. And it turns out that that isn't without harm, because there's a lot of research suggesting that the mere exposure to conspiracy theories, even if you don't believe them, just exposure is sufficient to observe a decreased intention among participants to reduce their carbon footprint or to engage in politics. Exposure to conspiracy theories decreases trust in institutions, even those that are unconnected to the original allegation. So specifically in this study, if people are exposed to a conspiracy theory about labor statistics, they may reduce trust in their local school board or library. So there is a generalized distrust that emerges from exposure to conspiracy theories. And of course, as we have seen on the 6th of January, and we have seen previously with Corona, conspiracy theories can also give rise to violence and vandalism. Now, to understand conspiracy theories, I would argue we have to differentiate between two different ways in which people might resort to conspiracy theories or conspiratorial rhetoric. Now, it is certainly the case that there are some people who are particularly prone to conspiracy theorizing. Now, we know that because we can predict it based on personality variables, but also because people who believe one conspiracy theory are more likely to believe a lot of others. In fact, you know, the sort of stereotypical guy with a tinfoil hat who'll believe any conspiracy theory, and they exist. And that is, to my mind, dispositional. However, there is another way by which people might resort to conspiracy theorizing, and that second way is perhaps even more frequent. It's not the less damaging in terms of fallout, but it is a different way by which people resort to conspiracy theories. And I want to explain that or show you why I think that's the case. Now, this second route is what I call pragmatic. It's a response to people's worldview being threatened. And I want to show you that based on the extremely well-established association between climate denial and free market fundamentalism or conservatism generally. There's a pervasive association between worldview and the rejection of climate science. Effectively, the more conservative people are, the more they believe in unregulated free markets, the more they deny climate change. And it turns out not to matter how you measure that, whether it's liberal, conservative, left, right, free market versus not free market, hierarchical versus egalitarian. There's so many wonderful constructs you can measure when it comes to climate change. They're all pointing in the same direction. The more conservative, the more people deny climate change. That effect is massive in the United States. It is quite large among English-speaking nations, and it is smaller but still present and significant across 24 other countries in this analysis of more than 5,000 participants. And this has been replicated maybe 100 times. So there's very little question about that. Now, I want to use that pre-established fact as a lever to see if I can trigger people into a conspiracy theory. Now, the logic here is as follows. If there's overwhelming scientific evidence that the climate is changing because of fossil fuel emissions, then if we take that seriously, if we believe it and we want to do something about it, and we want to mitigate climate change, well, then that scientific finding is a threat to my lifestyle, worldview, also profits, but really at the individual level, what's most important here, I think, is lifestyle and worldview. So what do I do if I'm in that position? Well, part of the problem, or part of the reason that there is overwhelming scientific evidence, is because most scientists agree. And climate change, we know that 97% of climate scientists are sharing the fundamentals of the science of climate change. So if that's the case, then as somebody whose identity is threatened by climate mitigation, then one way I can deal with this is to say, oh, they all agree. See, they're in a conspiracy. And I can deploy conspiratorial rhetoric to get rid of that threat. So in this study I want to tell you about, that was just published last week, I think, what I did was to present people with the with a query of the scientific consensus on 3 different issues. The fact that HIV causes AIDS, that CO2 causes climate change, and that vaccinations protect against diseases. Now, there's no scientific debate about those 3 propositions in the relevant expert community, but the public doesn't necessarily know that. So I asked people on MTurk, about 200 individuals, out of 100 climate scientists, how many do you think believe that CO2 causes climate change? And then, having done that, having got a perception of the consensus, I then asked people, oh, by the way, actually, all the scientists agree. I said this for AIDS and vaccinations and climate change, one after the other. And I instead asked participants to tell me why they think the scientists agree on that. And I gave them these different options rather, to choose and to tell me how strongly each of those contributed to the consensus. Now, here's one that I consider to be the right answer. It's because, the evidence compelled them to do that. And here are 5 others that are quite conspiratorial and that reflect the type of thing you read about in the media and climate denialist blogs and Twitter and all that, that the scientists are chasing funding and they're pursuing the world government, they're suppressing dissent. All the Galileos, the Google Galileos are being suppressed by established science in pursuit of this dogma. That language is just wonderfully conspiratorial, and it's encompassed in these options. All right. So what I'm now trying to show or examine is whether people's political views trigger an explaining away of the consensus by resorting to differential endorsement of these various reasons for the existence of the consensus. So what I'm now showing you is a couple of plots that are showing correlations. Now, this one is correlating conservatism with the various presumed reasons for a scientific consensus. Anything in gray is non-significant. And so what you can see here already is that for AIDS, there is just no correlation between conservatism and people's endorsement of the various reasons for the scientific consensus. Politics doesn't matter. AIDS is completely non-political. Now, 40 years ago, it might have been different, but now it is completely non-political. And now watch what happens with the very same people when it comes to climate change. Boom, all hell breaks loose. Strong positive correlation between conservatism and all these conspiratorial reasons, and symmetrically a strong negative correlation with what arguably is, what's actually happening, which is that all the physics and everything, the evidence points towards the scientific consensus. A huge discrepancy. And vaccinations, similar, slightly attenuated, but still conservatism drives people into saying the consensus is due to a conspiracy. And the extent to which they do, it turns out, intriguingly, matches the strength of the association between conservatism and climate denial or anti-vax sentiments. The numbers I'm showing you here is an average roughly of what the literature shows. It's a huge association between conservatism and climate denial. There's also an association between conservatism and anti-vax, notwithstanding, anecdotes suggesting it's a left-wing thing. No, it is not. Anti-vax is primarily on the political right, although it's not nearly as strong as climate change. And for AIDS, unfortunately, I don't have data. But this suggests to me that politics is triggering this rhetoric or acceptance of rhetoric that relates the consensus to a conspiracy. Now I'm showing you the same thing again. There are correlations, But I'm now correlating not politics, but people's dispositional conspiracism. There was another questionnaire in the study where I measured that. So I know how much people are prone to conspiracy theorizing. And now the pattern changes considerably. All of a sudden, AIDS gets a bifurcation there between the conspiratorial reasons and the real reason, and it's driven by people's disposition towards conspiracism. The same is true for vaccinations, massive. Climate change, all of a sudden, a little bit, but not that much. And again, the extent to which this happens maps precisely into the magnitude of the association between conspiracism and attitudes towards climate change, vaccinations, and AIDS, which we know from previous research with some precision, and that is completely mirrored here. So, what does that tell us? Well, the point I'm making here is that rejection of science is predicted by political views or worldviews. That is the strongest predictor we know of, in particular with climate science. If that creates a tension between my worldview and the science, then, as we have seen here, conspiracism, conspiratorial rhetoric is deployed in order to get off the hook. If I can say climate change is a hoax, I can fly to Bali on a holiday or buy an SUV. I'm off the hook. Hey, it's a hoax. Don't blame me. So I would argue that in many circumstances, people articulate conspiracy theories for tactical reasons rather than because they're disposed towards doing so. Some people are, but very often the rhetoric is not driven by their disposition. And if you want to know more about it, here's the Conspiracy Theory Handbook that came out about a year ago, where we summarize a lot of literature on this and also how to deal with conspiracy theories and how to combat them. And that's one of the links I popped into the chat at the beginning. Okay, that was my first foray into the subterranean world of knowledge dementors. Now I want to talk about not the public, but the media and how they handle this shock and chaos disinformation that I initially appealed to. Now, if you look at the literature on political science, on political agenda setting, then what you find is that for the last 20 years or 30 years or even more, political scientists suggest that the media, mainstream media, are a principal agent of agenda setting. And there's all sorts of causal effects you can identify, making it clear that that is true or was true. Because now, for some time, we had Donald Trump and Twitter. And as I want to show you now, that is not without consequence on agenda setting. Now, the reason I became interested in this issue was because before he took office, after he was elected, you may recall vaguely, perhaps, there was an event when Donald Trump got very upset on Twitter about the play, the cast of a Broadway play, Hamilton, on Broadway, which appealed for a diverse America in the presence of Vice President Pence, who attended the play. And Donald Trump went on about this in his usual style for quite some time. And if you look at the public response to that, then what you see is this. These are Google Trends data that show how often the public was searching for Trump and Hamilton. And that's the red line here. And you can see that on the night or right after the night when he started tweeting about this fairly trivial, but kind of like remarkable event nonetheless, the public was quite interested in this and searched a lot for Trump Hamilton. Why? Well, they searched because it was given a lot of attention. Why did Donald Trump tweet about Hamilton? Well, we'll never know. But what we do know is that on precisely that day, he settled a lawsuit against his Trump University for $25 million, including payment of a $1 million penalty to the state of New York. That's the blue line. The public paid no attention to this. I wonder why. Now, is this coincidence? Or did Donald Trump throw out this shiny object that distracts people, diverts people's attention? Well, we'll never know here, but we can formulate a hypothesis. And the hypothesis is that whenever the media cover an issue that is harmful to Donald Trump, then he tweets about something different. He diverts. And if that is successful, then the media should drop that harmful issue the next day. This is a conceptual and also statistical model of a possibility that Donald Trump might be tweeting to divert. Well, we investigated this in the paper I want to tell you about now, and we operationalized this as saying, okay, he certainly didn't like the Mueller investigation into his ties with Russia. So whenever the media talk about that, maybe he will divert. He'll talk about something else. What else would he talk about? Well, we have independent criteria to suggest that would be jobs, China, his immigration, the North Korea policy. These were all his political strengths at the time that we looked at these data. So we expect him to tweet about this. And then if that's successful, maybe the media will drop the coverage on the next day. So that was our goal. Our goal was to establish diversion. And we did this by scraping all of the New York Times, ABC News headlines, so both the mainstream paper and the major national news, TV news in the United States, all his tweets. And we then did a statistical analysis just relating coverage to his tweets. First, we looked at China, jobs, immigration, the three main topics we identified as representing Donald Trump's strengths, political strengths. And what did we find? Well, we found these regressions, which are so tiny you can't read them. So let me blow up the coefficients. In a nutshell, they're all positive and they're significant, meaning that the more the New York Times or ABC talks about Russia and Mueller, the more Donald Trump tweets about his political strengths on the same day. It's a statistically significant relationship that withstands inclusion of autocorrelations and 100 control variables and lots of other stuff. So it's pretty strong. Does this work? Well, yes. If we look at yesterday's tweets by Donald Trump and relate that to today's coverage of Russia and Mueller, we get negative numbers, and they're significant. The more Donald Trump talks about jobs, the less the New York Times will talk about Russia and Mueller the next day, all other things being equal. Now, that was true for two of the keywords, but not the third one, and the effect wasn't terribly strong. So we went out and tried to seek more generalization for this finding. And so what we now did was to examine the entire Twitter vocabulary by Donald Trump. And we also examined neutral coverage for comparison, because there might be something artifactual or special about Russia and Mueller. So we wanted to avoid that and look at everything. Now, I'm going to show you a whole bunch of graphs that I have to explain briefly. So we took word pairs to characterize each tweet. Each tweet had in it word pairs, and we counted the number of times he tweeted with that pair of words as a function of coverage, let's say, on Mueller and Russia in the New York Times. So that's estimating a regression coefficient, which we plot on the x-axis. Actually, we plot the t-values, so we get significance cutoffs that makes it easier to explain. And then we did another regression for the same word pair that related the media coverage the next day to the number of tweets the previous day. And that we plot on the y-axis. So now we get a space. And we get a space that contains word pairs. Here's one that's called X, whatever that is. 2 words out of the vocabulary are shown here. We have another word pair with 2 different words, and another one, and so on. So what do we expect to find if we have a space full of word pairs whose position is determined by these 2 regression coefficients? Well, the first answer is easy. If nothing is happening, we should just have a miss, a point cloud right smack in the middle. If Donald Trump doesn't care what the media say, and if they don't care what he says, everything should be in the middle. And we should observe that with neutral items that have nothing to do with Donald Trump. Now, if, however, Donald Trump is trying to divert, then some proportion of his vocabulary should increase in response to coverage that he clearly doesn't like. And if that is successful, then we should, moreover, find suppression of the media coverage. So in anything that follows, what we're looking for are these point clouds in different locations. So what did we find? Well, nothing at first. If you look at something like gardening, which presumably is of no great consequence to Donald Trump, and indeed, if you look for New York Times material on gardening and you relate it to Donald Trump's tweets, you find nothing other than, well, actually, it puts him to sleep. He tweets a lot less in response to increased coverage of gardening. That's a nice start. We just look at some neutral stuff. We have a synthetic null distribution here. I'm not going to bother explaining with that, even though it's kind of cool. And we did this over and over. We did it with the economy, football, gardening, skiing. The word clouds at the bottom here, which you probably can't read, are summarizing the coverage of the New York Times in those articles, just to confirm that we picked the right stuff. And yeah, you know, the skiing articles talk about mountains and the Olympics and all the stuff you expect them to. Doesn't really affect Donald Trump. I mean, nothing is happening. What about Russia Mueller? Well, looks a little different. Here's the New York Times reporting on Russia Mueller. What happens? Well, a lot of stuff happens. Donald Trump goes wild. He's tweeting a hell of a lot about a lot of different things. And a lot of the stuff he's talking about reduces coverage by the New York Times the next day of Russia Mueller. The New York Times is dropping Russia Mueller the day after Donald Trump tweets about certain things. Not just the New York Times, ABC News as well. The same relationship. Donald Trump goes wild on certain tweets. The media reduce their coverage. What is it he's tweeting about? Well, that's shown in these word clouds, as I'm also showing you on the left, the language being used by the New York Times in their coverage that is challenging to Donald Trump. So visually, what happens is this. The more the New York Times talks about Russia, the more Donald Trump talks about all these words. And again, of course, jobs, China, North Korea, all the stuff that represent his political strengths, which we knew from before, but now it emerges out of the entire vocabulary that we looked at. And then the next day, the media goes silent on Russia Mueller. That's what we found. This is a vastly exaggerated size of the effect. It is simply to illustrate the relationship in these 2 regression models. So, beware the diversion. Donald Trump played the media like a piano, and it worked. He was able to divert attention from things that were inconvenient to him. Which brings me to my last point about micro-targeted manipulation. Now, there are a couple of things in this world you should worry about, and it's not Donald Trump and the stuff that I've talked about so far. There's other stuff out there that are of greater concern to me. Facebook is one of them. Now, why? Well, for a number of reasons. The one I want to focus on here is the fact that likes on Facebook permit identification of a person's personality with greater accuracy than their spouse can do it. Here we have data from 5 years ago that looks at the ability of various different people, but also Facebook, to determine a person's personality. And it turns out that if you have 300 likes, then you know more than the person's spouse. If you have between 60 and 70, you can outperform a friend. And 10 likes are sufficient for a machine learning algorithm to understand a person better than their work colleague. This is based on volunteers taking a personality inventory, so we know what their actual personality is. And then the machine learning algorithm is collecting likes from Facebook. That was possible at the time, and is establishing this relationship. So you go on Facebook, you like stuff, Facebook will know who you are. And I mean, at a level of your personality. Does this matter? Well, I think it does. And here is some empirical evidence to suggest that. This is a study done by Matz et al. A couple of years ago that had more than 3 million participants in it. So power is not an issue. And what they did was to design cosmetic ads to appeal to extroverted or introverted participants. And this was validated independently of the experiment by judges and various other things. They had a long, complicated validation process to make sure that these ads were tapping different people of different personality preferentially. And the audience was also extroverted or introverted based on likes in the way that I just showed you. You can do this. And once you have people's likes and you know what their personality is, you can then go to Facebook and you can target an ad at those people based on their likes. Not technically based on their personality. You can't say, give me introverts, but you can go to Facebook and you can say, well, give me people who like whatever, you know, spy novels or romance novels or whatever it might be that identifies introverts and extroverts. To illustrate, here are two ads. Now that I told you, maybe you can guess that the one on the left is for extroverts and the one on the right is for introverts. They have a whole set of ads that are like that. And of course, you can advertise lipstick with the one on the left or the one on the right equally. It's just appealing to different people. Is this successful? Well, yes, it is. These are data plotting the conversion rate. That is, in this experiment, their dependent variable ultimately was how much money people spent on the cosmetics. So we're again not arguing about whether people are expressing an attitude or they're telling us something they don't believe. No, we're talking about selling people stuff. And you sell people stuff more if you match their personality. So an introverted audience given introverted ads buys a lot more than if they receive an extroverted ad. And the reverse is true for the other audiences. There's a complete crossover interaction, and boom, targeting works. At least to my satisfaction, it does. Some people have criticized the study. I thought the critiques were amusing, but I didn't take them terribly seriously, and the authors had a very good rebuttal to that. In this context, please note that Facebook is not hiding this. they own the patent on using inferred personality for targeted advertising. They say that that is the description of the application, and it's been granted. So Facebook is totally capable of doing this. Now, why does that matter? Well, I think it matters a great deal to democracy the moment you go from cosmetic ads to political messages. Because political messages, if they are micro-targeted towards people's personality, then you can manipulate a person and exploit their vulnerability without them knowing and without the political opponent being able to rebut the ad. So what happens is that you move political debate from the public sphere to furtive, private manipulation that is exploiting people's vulnerabilities. To me, that is concerning, to say the least. And if you want to know more about that, this is another one of the links I popped in the chat. I just, last year was one of the two coordinating lead authors on a major report for the European Commission, where we went into the details of not just this, but the entire relationship between technology online and democracy. And the news isn't good. We have a problem and we have to deal with it. And the regulators will. I'm convinced of that. I know that there will be regulation of social media platforms. And if they get it right, then that'll go a long way towards solving this problem. But in the meantime, until the regulators act, what are we going to do? Well, let me now tell you about a study that is in progress at the moment, and that employs the idea of reverse engineering micro-targeting by boosting users' knowledge about themselves so that they can identify an ad and then become more resistant to it. The experiment is simplicity itself. It's a two-group design, and we assign online participants at random to one condition where we boost their skills and we tell them something about their personality, and a control condition where we do nothing. The crucial manipulation is that we administer an extroversion introversion scale. We give people feedback on their score, and then their task is to classify ads as being targeted at them or not. That's all it is. So the experiment is extremely simple. Two groups. In the interesting condition, we tell people their extroversion score. In the other condition, we give them a score on some completely weird scale about technology that we don't think has anything to do with these ads. So in the critical experimental condition, the first feedback they get is some explanation of what extroversion introversion means. It's a little longer than what I'm showing you here. It went on and people really had to read it. But basically, we just tell them, hey, you know, this is extroversion introversion. Then we give them personalized, correct, accurate feedback. We tell them, oh, you're extroverted. In fact, you are more extroverted than 74 people of your age. And this is the type of graph an extroverted person would have seen. We do the same if they're introverted. We say, oh, you're introverted. You're more introverted than 98 people of your age. Those numbers were correct because we know so much about introversion, extroversion, that we have norms for age groups that tell us how introverted and extroverted somebody is relative to the population. So we provide accurate feedback about their personality. Then here's the experimental task. Here's an ad. Do you think it's targeted at you? People click yes or no. And guess what now? This is probably, yep, targeted at an extrovert. So if you have a high extroverted score and you're accurate, then you should say yes. If you're an introvert, you should say no. I mean, the should comes in quotation marks, but there sort of is a right answer because we know independently what the ad is doing and we know people's personality. So if they're good at it, at matching their personality to the ad, then their performance should go up. And here are the data from the first experiment. On the left is the control condition where we tell people nothing relevant. On the right is the one where we give them personalized personality feedback. Now, if you look at these are Bayesian credible intervals here surrounding the red dots. If you look at the control condition, people are actually above chance at this task, but they're not terribly good at it. They're you know, at somewhere around 60% or so. After that 3 or 4 minute intervention, we tell them their extroversion score, they go up, their performance goes up nearly 30%. It's an amazing increment for a very simple manipulation. Now, we ran 2 more experiments to figure out what's needed for this to happen. And what we looked at is whether it is sufficient to just tell people about introversion, extroversion. Those are the 2 green dots here. And the answer is no. If you just tell people, this is an extrovert, that's an introvert, haha, now do the task, then giving them that information has no beneficial effect. If you give them the personality inventory, that's the sort of brownish dots, then yes, there is an effect. It's a considerable boost, but it's about half of what it was before. The crucial difference being that they're not given feedback of where they sit. So in other words, if I give you feedback on who you are after you take the personality inventory, I boost your performance by 30%. If I just give you the questionnaire and you sort of think about it, then your performance, the boost is cut in half, but you still benefit. If I just tell you what the personality attributes are, no effect, no difference. Compared to a control, which again does perform above chance, but not nearly as well. So what does that tell us? Well, it tells us that people can actually learn to detect that they're being targeted with ads based on their personality in a relatively short time. And the performance improvement is considerable, up to 30% if you do it right. Now, arguably, we haven't shown this yet, but arguably that is a first step towards resilience, because in order to resist manipulation, the first thing you gotta do is to discover that you are being manipulated. And in a sense, that's precisely what we're doing here. We're teaching people to detect when they're being manipulated with ads. And the obvious next steps are currently underway, which is to see how this generalizes to political messages and whether from recognition follows resistance to persuasion or manipulation. And with that, I thank you for your attention. I think I've stuck to time, and I'm more than happy, of course, to take questions.
Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you very much. Yeah, Jonathan, I can see your hand raised.
Hi, Stephan. Really, really interesting talk. Thank you so much.
Sure.
This is what I'm breaking my head with during your talk and before your talk and probably after your talk too. So there's one simple saying about all these people who believe in conspiracy theories. You've been very careful not to use that word, and that is stupid. You haven't used that word, but I know many of my friends think that, and it's obviously a simplification. And a slightly more subtle word is conservative, and you certainly did use that word in your talk. And my question refers to actually self-reflection. Where do I and you and maybe all of us in the conference fall into conspiracy theory. Let's make a vague assumption that we're all liberals. We're all scientists, and maybe there's a high correlation between scientists and liberals. So are we really immune to it? Or perhaps the very story that we're telling ourselves, that we believe in science, despite all the evidence. There's so much evidence that we should not be believing in science, at least in our own domain. We know about psychology. We know that most of what's been published in psychology is nonsense. We know that. Yet we think of ourselves as smart. We think of ourselves that science can tell us. Why should climate science be any better? We know in our own science, most of what we published is nonsense. So why should climate science be any better? Why should research about age? We have so much data telling us, so maybe we're the ones who are falling to our own conspiracy theories as liberals. Do I believe what I'm asking? Probably not, but how do I answer this question?
No, it's a great point. I mean, first of all, yes, a lot of stuff that is being published in psychology is rubbish, but here's the thing. We know it's rubbish before it even fails to replicate. One of the interesting things about this whole replication crisis thing is that before the replicators went out to replicate stuff that then failed to replicate, they asked a bunch of experts, will this replicate or not? And the experts were damn good. And frankly, yes, I can also look at a paper and I can make a very good guess about whether or not it'll replicate. And if it's not pre-registered and there's some Excel graphs in there without standard errors, I actually don't even look at it beyond that because I know it's not good. So basically what I'm saying, number one, I can flip it around. The fact that we know what won't replicate ahead of time tells us that there is something about our science that is a signal, and we can tell when there's a signal. Number two, climate science is a natural science, and I hate to do this as a cognitive scientist to myself. But yes, physics is a little different from cognitive science. You know, airplanes do fly, and they fly because physical scientists have figured this out. And the climate is changing based on physics that's 150 years old. It was, you know, the CO2 effect was observed in 1859, and global warming was scientifically examined for the first time in 1896. And ever since, there has been very little scientific doubt about the basics. So that's the other difference. Now, the bigger question here is, how do you know that we're not conspiracy theorists, irrespective of the science or whatever? Well, that's where it gets to be very interesting. And I would argue that together with some philosophers, not all of them, but quite a few, that there are distinct cognitive styles that define a conspiracy theory and the people who hold them. And I've written a bunch of papers on this, which I'm happy to share if you're interested. For example, one of the things about conspiracy theories is that they're internally inconsistent. People will believe that COVID-19 is a hoax, but they will also believe that it's a bioweapon designed by the Chinese. Well, it can't be both. Come on. If it's a weapon and killing people, it can't be a hoax. And yet people will believe both of these mutually exclusive things. And the reason they do is because what they're really expressing is a rejection of the official account. And they don't care how they do that. They're not bound by the rules of logic. So whereas scientists, of course, we know are striving for coherence. In fact, we know that if something is incoherent, it's wrong. And so there are other, you know, there are like 7 different characteristics of conspiracy theorizing. If you go to the conspiracy theory handbook, it's all explained in there. So you can, it's actually very easy. You look at this and you figure, well, okay, am I doing any of that? If you are, then yes, you might be a conspiracy theorist. But if you're not, then it's less likely that you are. And the thing about conspiracy theories is that they're all necessarily engaging in these flawed cognitive processes, because otherwise there wouldn't be a conspiracy theory, because the evidence isn't there to support them. So they have to be supported in a different way. I'm just waiting for questions. I don't know who's moderating. Are you moderating, you?
Anna, would you like to ask your question, please?
Yes. Hello, and thank you very much for your wonderful talk. I have a question about the domain specificity of the conspiracy theories. So is it possible to create what you suggested as immunity or a capability to resist to, for example, manipulation that are done to you due to micro-targeting?
Okay.
And well, what do you think? Is it possible that one person will be resilient to, let's say, manipulations about climate change, but completely non-resilient to, let's say, manipulations about, I don't know, and anti-feminism, like anti-feminist conspiracies, like, I don't know, all people are only making everything up and everything like that. So
Sure.
what do you?
Yeah, great question. I have a paper in the pipeline with a PhD student where we partially addressed that question. And what we did was to create a 4-minute training video that is teaching people how to detect misleading rhetorical strategies that are employed by radicals, by extremists. And we developed the training video based on an analysis of extremist YouTube videos. We identified these rhetorical techniques. We abstracted them to be content-free, domain-free. So the training video itself taught people something about misleading rhetoric without, however, pointing a finger at whatever, some particular brand of political extremism. We kept it as neutral as possible. And then we split people into 2 groups. One was presented with radical Islamist material. The other group was presented with radical Islamophobic material, right-wing extremist content that was anti-Muslim, versus Islamist material that was anti-Western, whatever, okay? And we observed pretty much exactly equal transfer to both types of radicalizing information, and the video inoculated people successfully in both cases against being misled. And relatively big effects. I mean, not tiny, I mean, nice effects that I would write home about. And so in this particular instance, it didn't seem to matter which way it went. I have another paper in the works with van der Linden and Rosenbeek from Cambridge, where we did a similar thing with very brief videos, teaching people not to be misled in various different ways. And we can again show in each instance that there is transfer from the very generic video to specific instances of misleading content. And it doesn't seem to matter what the content is. People can generalize that. So the evidence is pretty encouraging on that you can, give people this broad spectrum inoculation against being misled.
Yeah, thank you. First, thanks for a very interesting and eye-opening presentation. My question is kind of an extension of the last question. So people we can learn that people we are being manipulated. Somebody is trying to manipulate us. But if that person is saying is in line with our worldview, do we even care? So do because you show that even when a politician lies very blatantly, people don't really support him less for doing so. So do we really care, or do we just accept it because it's in line with our worldview, it enforces our worldviews?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I mean, first of all, yes, I told you that lying by politicians doesn't matter. But what I haven't told you is, number one, that's only true under certain circumstances. And number two, even though they may not care about the lies, they are still able to adjust their belief if a lie is corrected. I published a couple of papers, one last year, the other one a few years ago with Brian Swire and Adam Berinsky and colleagues, where we showed that with Trump voters and Bernie Sanders supporters. And in a nutshell, what we showed there is that you can change people's belief in specific misstatements made by their favorite politician, and they will happily adjust that belief in the expected direction. So they're completely rational in their belief adjustment in response to a correction. And as a first approximation, it's pretty symmetrical between Trump and Sanders. Not quite, but surprisingly symmetrical. What we also found is that it made zero difference to how they felt about Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. So in that sense, you're absolutely right. Truth, in that sense, truth doesn't matter. You can correct people and say that's wrong, and they say, oh, okay, that's wrong. But they're not going to change their feelings for Trump or Sanders. Now, here's the thing. We've done the same study in Australia using Australian politicians and Australian voters. And guess what? They care a great deal. If they find out their politicians are lying, their intention to vote for them declines dramatically. The effect size was 10 times greater in Australia than it was in the United States. So it's not necessarily the truth, the case that truth doesn't matter. It's only in certain circumstances that it doesn't. Now, we know what those circumstances are from other work by Oliver Howe and colleagues, who published a wonderful paper in 2018, where they were able to turn on and off people's tolerance for lies based on whether they felt disenfranchised by a system or not. And it turns out that if people feel that democracy isn't working for them, or if they feel threatened in their privileged status, then they will accept a politician who is pretending to be their authentic champion. They will tolerate lies from that, but only under the condition that they feel left out or threatened. Now, that's, I think, why Republicans think Donald Trump is honest, because they've replaced factual accuracy with authenticity. They think he's honest because he's speaking his mind and he's acting on their behalf authentically. And if he lies, oh, well, that just means he's really authentically opposing the elite, because honesty is an elite norm. So if I want to be a populist, I'm going to say education sucks, honesty sucks, right? The media suck. I will attack everything that is elitist to show my credentials to the real people. And that is what these guys do. That's what Trump does. That's what Johnson in the UK does. I can think of a bunch of other populist politicians, that Brazilian dude, whatever his name is, I can never pronounce it. That's their shtick. They lie because it identifies them as a hero of the people.
Yeah, I think we have time for one more question. So,
can I go then? If you don't see
Jonathan, do you want to ask again?
Yes. Stephan, we talk a moment about religion.
Sure.
Let's assume I'm an atheist.
Yeah.
For the question.
Me too.
Is there any way I should be looking at conspiracy theories and at religious people or at religion in general in a different way?
Well, religion is tricky, as I'm sure you appreciate if you live in Israel. And the reason it's tricky is because it is not always clear what it'll do. In the context of science denial, for example, religion is an incredibly strong predictor of the rejection of evolution. I mean, huge, right? No surprises. I mean, yeah, of course, if you're deeply religious, you're not going to believe in Darwinian evolution. But other sciences, no, it's extremely difficult to find a consistent pattern. Climate change is okay. Religious people who are also conservative will reject climate change. But the Pope wrote an encyclica on climate change saying, we're a stewardship of the planet, blah, blah, whatever, we have to protect it. And so, it's very difficult to be sure. So I'm actually fairly reluctant to make blanket statements about religion, because it can go any way you want. And the same with conspiracy theories. I mean, you could argue that religion is an organized conspiracy theory. I mean, I'm not going to get into that debate. You can argue that, but I don't think there's any particular reason that, Anglican priests in the United Kingdom are more susceptible to conspiracy theories than other people. I don't think so.
Anglican priests in Great Britain believe in evolution by natural selection, at least to the best of my knowledge.
How many? What was the percentage?
No, I know that the head of the Anglican Church believes.
Oh, of course. Well, yeah. And the Vatican Academy of Sciences has come out in favor of evolution. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be anti-scientific.
Okay, so Steve, thank you so much for fascinating and very important.
Thank you.
It was really terrific.
I wish I could actually be there and have some hummus or something. But
We too.
We also wish we could be there and eat some hummus.
Yeah, maybe next time.
Maybe next year.
Take
Thank
care,
you,
guys.
Stephan.
Bye.
Thank you so
Bye.
much. If I may just take another 20 seconds, since this is our locking keynote. So first of all, let's give another applause to Stephan. Thank you so much. I would like to thank, obviously, our speakers today, Stephan, and our Israeli speakers that we heard before. I'd like to thank the students that presented the posters today, and special thanks to Bar-Ilan studio staff, the studio staff from where we are broadcasting currently, Shunit Cohen, who assisted us with technologies in all the Zoom lectures, Maya Menzel and Lishai Katsav, who created the poster gather environment, who did so much work on the background of this conference, the Brainstorm student team that gave us a fun and exciting social evening yesterday for whoever has joined us, Dana Pinto, Mimi Schwartz, Yael Caspi, Jonathan Brand, and Lishai Katsav. Of course, the organizing committee. And as you said, Stephan, I'm really hoping to meet you all next year in real Akko. So thanks for all the participants, and see you next year. And thanks again, Stephan. Thank you.
Take care. Bye.
לשנה הבאה בעכו הבנויה.
בדיוק.